CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. A downbeat assessment and a warning on stagflation. The message from the IMF's latest global health check.
The EU pledges more aid to Afghanistan as G20 leaders meet to discuss the worsening humanitarian situation.
Backing biodiversity, China's president launches a fund to safeguard species in developing countries.
One of the UK's worst public health failures, the damning verdict of a parliamentary report on the handling of COVID-19.
And how private companies are taking up the challenge of protecting wild elephants in China. A downbeat outlook and the bleak prospect of stagflation. The International Monetary Fund has scaled down its world economic outlook. Global recovery continues but has lost some momentum. The headline revisions are modest. Global growth for 2021 marginally down to 5.9% and unchanged for 2022 at 4.9%. But that masks large downgrades for some countries. Let's take a look at some of them. The United States, now that forecast dropped 1% to 6%. Now, Europe's largest economy, Germany, that dropped 0.5% to 3.1%. Meanwhile, the outlook for the low-income developing country group, the ASEAN 5, that dropped 1.4% to 2.9%. Well, earlier I spoke to Mark Oswald, the chief economist at ADM Investor Services International, and he gave me his assessment.
In Europe, I think the interesting aspect of it is that actually, while they've revised down Germany, there's been a sharp upward revision to Italy, plus 0.9, and a reasonably sharp one to France. Elsewhere, the key obviously is the US. It reflects two things. One, the spread of the pandemic in Asia and the way that it has impacted a lot of Asian and the Australia-New Zealand complex. But above all, it also reflects the fact that we've got these enormous problems with supply chain bottlenecks across the world. And they are proving to me much more durable than I think most people expected.
So we've got bottlenecks, we've got the ongoing pandemic. I mean, the head of the IMF said that of global economic recovery, we're unable to walk forward properly. It's like walking with stones in our shoes. You talk about this big divergence, though, of economic prospects across countries. It's quite stark.
It is very stark, and some of it does actually, as the IMF has already pointed out last week, reflects the fact that we've got very different or very divergent vaccination rates, and that divergence in vaccination rates is having an impact. You once only got to look at Australia and New Zealand, which were very, very low prior to the outbreaks that we've seen there. Now they've started to accelerate, and hopefully that will have the impact. But I think also we're also starting to having to contend with a good deal of inflation. And for the emerging countries, above all, this rise in food inflation, which is inordinately challenging given the poverty levels that there are there.
So the great vaccine divide, inflation across commodities, across products. I mean, in terms of policy priorities, if you like, is climate change still up there?
I think it's still the great hope that climate change is going to be driving the recovery. Once we've got to a stage where we can live with the pandemic, that we have all this big momentum behind moving into renewables, in the broadest sense of the word, so including also things which are more challenging like hydrogen, where we need a whole load more infrastructure. It is also, as we've seen with the changes in energy prices, what you start to get is knock-on effects. So to a certain extent, it's not that easily managed. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges going forward.
Is the key thing finance then? I mean, where would you say the bigger push needs to be then to pick up the pace of global economic recovery?
I still think the emphasis is very much more on governments to do more, whether it's in terms of initiatives on climate change. It's also in supporting those parts of the economies which have actually been really badly affected and making a judgment call, which will be extraordinarily difficult, on where we're actually going to find out that we've got too much capacity now in this new world post-pandemic, and where we've got a huge amount of undercapacity or lost capacity as a result of the pandemic. And for that, finance is absolutely critical, ensuring that those parts which are needed get the critical support that they will need, both fiscally and in terms of credit.
Well, as storm clouds seem to be gathering for the world economy, the IMF too is under a cloud of controversy after allegations that its head, Kristalina Georgieva, artificially boosted China's ranking in a World Bank report on the best countries to do business with in her previous job at the bank. Well, let's talk now to Caroline Malone in Washington. So, Caroline, what's the latest on this controversy?
Well, the IMF Executive Board has now expressed full confidence in the leadership of Kristalina Georgieva, its managing director, following those allegations that she played a part in manipulating data at the World Bank. It's been a month since an independent inquiry concluded she actually played a central role in meddling with the 2018 report on doing business. But after many IMF Executive Board meetings, they've decided Ms. Georgieva's actions did not conclusively demonstrate that she acted improperly. They released a statement on it, and I'll read part of it to you now. The board trusts in the managing director's commitment to maintaining the highest standards of governance and integrity in the IMF. So clearly they're continuing to back her there. However, meanwhile, the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen actually spoke to Georgieva on Monday and told her the investigation does raise legitimate concerns for the US. And without further evidence, however, there is no basis for a change of leadership, according to readouts of the call that we read. Well, despite that, the IMF's World Economic Outlook report on the virtual press conference, I should say, on the World Economic Outlook report, some members were actually questioned about the data scandal. The speaker, Agita Gopinath, the IMF's chief economist, reiterated that the World Bank is different from the IMF, that it has vigorous ways of checking its data, has careful reviews, multiple departments and economists are involved, and it has an independent data office to review all of its work.
Now, Caroline, let's focus on the World Economic Review press conference for a moment. There was a specific mention of the United States and medium-term inflation risks. What more was said on that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's concern for the US and, of course, the world in economic recovery from the COVID pandemic. And inflation, as you say, there is one of the risks that has been flagged in the report and is being closely watched here in the US as well. The rise in prices, which includes a rise in energy prices, is really being felt across the world. Supply-side risks in particular were mentioned. The IMF says it's very unusual to see these as part of the economic recovery. We've seen lags in shipping with a backup of container ships to carry global goods. And that essentially means, they say, that supply is not matching demand. And that's why there's in part been a rise in prices of commodities. Well, the IMF says it expects the supply chain breakdown could persist into the next year. But if it had resolved, then inflation in the US and globally could return to normal levels. However, look, there's still tremendous uncertainty. We don't know how much longer, of course, the pandemic and any of the COVID potential variants will affect the United States and the entire world's economy.
Caroline Malone in Washington, thank you.
Oil prices continued their rally, jumping to their highest levels in 3 years. Brent crude topped $84 a barrel for the first time since 2018, fueled by shortages in the supply of energy in key economies like China.
There's been record demand for the European Union's first ever green bond, set aside specifically for environmental projects. So far, the largest ever green bond sale has raised almost $156 billion. The money will help finance the bloc's COVID-19 recovery fund.
Severe flooding in the northern Chinese province of Shanxi has driven the price of coal to another record high. Several mines have been closed in the region, which is a key area for coal production. 15 people have died in the past days, with the floods affecting around 2 million residents.
Samsung's head has admitted in court to the illegal use of a controlled substance. Lawyers for Jay Lee insisted that the sedative, which he used multiple times over 5 years, was required for medical purposes. He was given parole in August after being convicted of bribery and embezzlement in January.
European Union leaders have pledged a $1.15 billion aid package for Afghanistan to avert a major humanitarian and socio-economic collapse.
The commitment was made at a virtual G20 summit hosted by Italy. Afghanistan's economy has been verging on collapse since the Taliban's takeover in August, with food prices soaring and banks running out of money. There's also concern over a possible mass exodus of Afghan refugees.
Well, let's talk to Hermione Kitson, who joins us from Rome. Hermione, this is something that Italy's Prime Minister Draghi has been really pushing for, hasn't it?
Well, that's correct. These landmark talks here in Rome, they concluded just a short time ago, and then Prime Minister Mario Draghi, he held a press conference. He said that Afghanistan is facing a serious humanitarian crisis, but did describe these talks today as very productive. Now, not just G20 countries participated in this virtual meeting today, but also organisations like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and also the United Nations. And the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said saving lives is really the top priority.
Afghanistan is standing at a crossroads. It has been torn, but could now go on a new path of independent and peaceful development. The first and foremost problem to tackle right now is people's livelihoods. China is assisting with 200 million RMB worth of supplies, including food, winter supplies, vaccines, medication and other emergency assistance material.
Now, you mentioned that many G20 leaders took part in the talk, so let's look ahead to the G20 Leaders Summit this month. How does this maybe set the stage?
Well, as you said, then in 2 weeks' time, these leaders will meet again, but in person here in Rome for the G20 summit, the proper summit here at the end of the month. And that will be an opportunity to really consolidate the commitments that were reached today. As you mentioned earlier, the European Union has pledged another $1 billion in aid, but the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says that unless the Taliban does adhere to its conditions, it's not going to pledge any further ongoing aid, long-term aid and support. So a big day today in terms of the international community really rallying its support behind the Afghan people, trying to do what it can for its population as the very difficult winter months come as they approach. And it's really hoped that this G20 summit, the next summit in person, will see some really strong commitments from world leaders for the months ahead.
Hermione Kitson in Rome, thank you very much for the update.
Well, let's talk now to Professor Michael Semple, who is from the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice at Queen's University in Belfast. He joins us now. Welcome back to the programme. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us today. So the UN Secretary-General has said that Afghanistan is at a make-or-break moment. Do you think he's right? What are the main concerns?
Well, he's certainly right in that, you know, there is a crisis facing Afghanistan, but you know, I'm not sure that really he'll be able to get as much done about it as he would like, because the challenges are really immense. You know, we're talking about a potential 50% collapse of GDP in the country, and I'm not sure that any of the measures considered by the G20 is really going to take the sting out of that.
Well, as you say, the economy a key concern, but different ideas on how to deal with it. What are the options? Well,
you know, part of it rests on, you know, how do you deal with the current Taliban administration in Afghanistan? Everybody says they want to help Afghanistan, but you know, most countries are you know, say that They can't recognize the Afghan government. It's grabbed power by force against the will of its own population and against an express international consensus. So first of all, they've been looking at ways of delivering humanitarian assistance which go direct to the population and really cut out the Taliban or Afghan government. So you can do food distributions, you can perhaps help some health clinics, but Afghanistan has lost far much more than that. Afghanistan has lost all its international development assistance. It's lost its access to the international banking system. It's in economic freefall. So the question is, can you put in place serious economic assistance? And without working closely with the Afghan administration, that's impossible. So do you or don't you? And I think that we will see greater differences arising over that in the weeks ahead.
And something else that the international community say they're concerned about is Afghanistan becoming a refuge for terrorists. How serious a threat is that? And do you think that the Taliban are set up to deal with them?
Well, Afghanistan already is a refuge for terrorists. It's not a question about whether it's going to become one. They're already there. The question is, will the Afghan authorities be inclined and capable of dealing with them? Of course, they've often said that, but then they say lots of things to persuade people to support them, or, of course, to persuade the Americans to withdraw their troops, as they did. And so far, we've seen no sign of actions by the Taliban against foreign militants, except they've undertaken limited security actions and military operations against Daesh, Islamic State, who they consider a local rival.
And you touched on this already, but the G20 countries, of course, have very different approaches to Afghanistan. So how easy will it be to reach a consensus on the way forward?
Well, I mean, I think there is the makings of a consensus in that everybody agrees they need to do something. So in the first case, I think that we will see more movement on getting humanitarian assistance moving. That'll be the first step. Then, of course, there will be difficult discussions around whether economic assistance is possible. I suspect that one way forward that they may find is to renew their commitments to a peace process, to say that this political story isn't over, that there should be continued support for a progress in Afghanistan towards a broad-based administration, inclusive political system, and full economic assistance will be resumed at that point. There is a possibility of getting a consensus around that, but of course a lot of work will be required before they get agreement on that.
Professor Michael Semple from Queen's University in Belfast, thanks very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you.
Coming up on CGTN, one of the worst ever public health failures. British lawmakers criticise the government's early response to the pandemic.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
billions of years of evolution on Earth. Different life forms sharing one planet, from single cells to complex ecosystems. They integrate, split, prosper, and perish. They affect our planet and are in turn affected by this diversified world of which humans are a part. It's time to build a shared future for all on Earth. Tune in to CGTN's special coverage on our global commitment to the planet.
Welcome back. Now remember, CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. Here in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Chinese property giant Evergrande has missed a third round of bond payments. $148 million were due to be paid on Monday. Let's talk now to Sarah Walton, who joins us from New York. So, Sarah, how are the markets reacting to all this?
Well, all three major indices were up just a moment ago, but they have dipped down into the red this morning, so looking a little volatile on the markets today. Probably a number of factors at play there, actually, but we did see US markets tumble back in September when we first heard that Evergrande had missed a round of bond payments. Such is the concern that it sparks amongst investors here. The concern really being that the collapse of a company the size of Evergrande could, has the potential to slow China's economy, and China being the biggest trading partner of the United States. But analysts are really saying they're not hugely surprised about what we're hearing about Evergrande today, given that the company had already missed two rounds of bail payments. They're saying that this is further evidence that the company may not be able to survive this and may have to be broken up. They say that if that happens, that bondholders would be offered something in the order of around 20 cents per dollar on the original value of the bonds that they hold. But concern now really just growing that this is not an issue that is solely affecting Evergrande, that this is spreading through that, crucial real estate sector in China. For example, we've already heard from one major Evergrande competitor, Fantasia. They also missed a bond payment deadline, and a number of other real estate agencies in China now, so Modern Land, Cynic Holdings, also trying to push back their payment deadlines.
And Sarah, some other companies to focus on, some big third quarter earnings results around the corner. Tell us about those.
Yes, that's right. Third quarter earnings season kicking off this week. Starting off with some big names in the world of banking, actually. We've got JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley. They're all expected by the end of the week. But expectations for this round of results, not too great, to be honest. We've already heard from about 24 companies in the S&P 500, their third quarter results out, including from some big names like FedEx and Nike. They're saying that things like the supply chain and labour shortage caused by the pandemic, and also increased transport and freight costs, that's all eating into their profit, and it is going to do so, especially as we head into this upcoming holiday season, so the all-important Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Christmas shopping season that is coming up. So profits still expected to be healthy, but just nothing like what we were seeing in the second quarter, when a lot of companies, particularly companies here in the US, were benefiting from a lifting of COVID-19 restrictions that we saw back in the spring.
Sarah Walton in New York, thanks very much. The UK's failure to stop COVID from spreading in the early stages of the pandemic was one of the worst public health failures in the country's history.
Well, that's the verdict of a report by MPs into the government's response to the virus. But there were more positive words on other aspects, such as the UK's vaccine rollout. Let's speak to Andrew Wilson. Andrew, good to see you. Can you tell us a little bit more about this report and its findings?
Yeah, it's worth bearing in mind that the government hasn't even initiated its own public inquiry into how the pandemic was run and what was learned throughout the pandemic. That says that they will have their own report officially conducted after COVID is over. So this is something that's come in a little bit not unexpected for them, but it's not something that they organised. It comes from two parliamentary committees, the Health and Social Care Committee and the Science and Technology Committee, MPs from both sides in the House of Commons interviewing other MPs and other officials and health officials and so on about what they feel about how the pandemic went and how it was run. The general overarching opinion seems to be the government was slow and the government was late at the beginning, that it lent too heavily on this idea of herd immunity, allowing the infection to spread, and that being an inevitability that they should accept. They also point out some of the large events that were allowed to take place very close to the actual eventual lockdown period, like the Cheltenham races and the rugby at Twickenham, which could have been so-called super spreader events. They also talk about how the government gathered its advice and how it organised the scientific evidence that it lent on, and also they had words about the test and trace, which they said was poorly organised. Before we play my report, perhaps I should just quote one thing that was written by MPs. They said the veil of ignorance through which the UK viewed the initial weeks of the pandemic was partly self-inflicted. Here's my report for the day. It's an account of a government caught by surprise, a cabinet that failed to respond effectively when the pandemic struck, and of a resulting delay in action that cost lives. The cross-party report by MPs acknowledges a mix of successes and defeats, but labels the initial government decision, backed by its scientists, to embrace the concept of herd immunity by infection as one of the worst ever public health failures. In the absence of a Downing Street response, a lesser-known minister was sent out to respond. He declined to say sorry.
I suppose you want to start with an apology to the British public.
We moved quickly in response to the vaccine. Obviously, this report has just come out, so we want to look at it and consider it. That's why we've also got an inquiry to ensure that where there are lessons to learn, we do so. But we followed throughout the scientific advice. We got the vaccine deployed extremely quickly. We protected our NHS from the surge of cases. But of course, if there are lessons to learn, we're keen to do so.
On the vaccine, the report is positive, describing the whole approach from investment through research and development to the eventual and speedy rollout of the inoculation operation as one of the most effective initiatives in UK history. But it's the failures that will dominate the headlines, allowing former government advisers like Dominic Cummings to wade in as well.
Me and others put into place work to try and improve the system in 2020 after the first wave. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister, being the joke that he is, has not pushed that work through. Now we have a joke Prime Minister and a joker leading the Labour Party, and we obviously need a new political system.
The government, of course, will want to wait and see the results of its own inquiry, but that's not due to really get started until next year. But this report, which talks of big achievements and big mistakes, is likely to be taken as a measured assessment of UK pandemic management. Whether it's enough to be deployed effectively by the Prime Minister's enemies is another matter.
Well, big achievements, big mistakes. I'd like to fast forward to today, though, Andrew, and another crucial issue. The UK's biggest port struggling with the volume of shipping containers, teamed, of course, with the shortage of lorry drivers. What are the implications?
Well, yeah, this is Felixstowe that we're talking about, UK's biggest port, its busiest port. 36% of the UK's shipping traffic comes through Felixstowe. They had some problems during the summer, which eventually righted themselves again. They're having problems again now. They simply can't move the volume of containers that are being offloaded or intended to be offloaded in Felixstowe for delivery throughout the country. And so Maersk, the container company, the Danish container company, is now having to reroute some of its ships away from Felixstowe to other ports across Europe, where the containers can be offloaded onto smaller vessels and then brought into Felixstowe. So whereas containers that would normally take a matter of minutes to be offloaded from the container vessels, put onto transportation and clear of the port, are now taking a matter of 2 weeks, 3 weeks to be able to get to that situation, which is really slowing things down. It's another example of the post-pandemic economy moving again. Logjam, this is not uncommon in a lot of ports around the world. Also, costs are going up in terms of shipping at the moment. For example, for a container to come from China to Europe, it now costs 6 times more than it did a year ago. So it's put down, as far as the government's concerned, to another example of a post-pandemic readjustment. But of course, we've got a government now being faced with the truck driver shortage, which is being highlighted again in Felixstowe, with the pig farmers up in arms because they're having to destroy livestock. They've got gas hikes, which are now leading to this well-publicised energy crisis, bailouts needed for carbon dioxide producing plants, and also probably for the big manufacturing plants like steel and ceramics. So all this, and now the pandemic report as well coming out from the House of Commons, you'd think this would be complete open goal to the opposition to really start taking the government down. Well, that doesn't appear to be happening. The government is holding fast, and its policy seems to be, let's just sit this through. It's been a difficult pandemic. There will be changes, but things will settle down, and we will be able to make adjustments. That message thus far to the British public appears to be working. People's patience may wear thin. It got pretty difficult when there was a petrol crisis 2 weeks ago. But for the time being now, the government numbers remain strong, and this policy of holding fire and keeping calm seems to be working in their favour at the moment.
So a post-pandemic readjustment that's turning out quite expensive. Andrew Wilson, thank you.
You're watching Global Business Europe. Still ahead. Backing biodiversity. China launches a multi-million-dollar fund to help developing countries protect species and natural habitats.
It's the first day in Germany that vaccination centers like this one are offering a third jab.
There are fears there could be a fifth wave of COVID-19 cases.
Market watchers have a keen eye on infection rates,
safety and efficacy of COVID-19 shots.
France closed schools in the first lockdown in spring last year.
France has been a leader in vaccinating youngsters.
If a spike necessitates another lockdown,
Italy is now close to reaching its target of immunising 80% of the population over the age of 12.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
Roger, you loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation. We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome! We hope it will happen. We have to live it up.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Robin Dwyer and me, Juliet Mann. Our top stories. A downbeat assessment and a warning on stagflation. The message from the IMF's latest global health check.
The EU has pledged more aid to Afghanistan as G20 nations met to discuss the worsening humanitarian situation. Leaders agreed to try and save the country's failing banking system and work to ensure it doesn't become a hub for terrorism.
We have agreed that Afghanistan cannot become a refuge for international terrorists.
This has been a concern for all leaders and means we must coordinate in the fight against terrorism.
China's President Xi Jinping has launched a $232 million fund to support biodiversity protection in developing countries, and he called on other nations to contribute.
He gave a speech on day 2 of the UN Biodiversity Summit in Kunming in southwest China, where world leaders are trying to hammer out a new framework to protect our planet's species. Tao Yuan reports.
China will invest 1.5 billion yuan, or over $230 million to support biodiversity protection in developing countries. An announcement from President Xi Jinping today at the Leaders Summit of the United Nations Biodiversity Conference.
In the face of the dual tasks of economic recovery and environmental protection, developing countries need help and support all the more. China will take the lead and contribute 1.5 billion yuan to set up the Kunming Biodiversity Fund, which will support biodiversity development in developing countries. China calls for and welcomes all parties to contribute and support efforts to strengthen the protection of biodiversity.
The president made the announcement via video link. He also said China would ramp up efforts to build a natural conservation system with a new national park system at its core. The president added that renewable energy development was also a priority.
We will accelerate the planning of large-scale photovoltaic and wind power projects in our deserts and nearby areas. The first phase of these projects, with a combined installed capacity of 100 million kilowatts, will soon begin in an orderly manner.
This week's conference is expected to release a joint declaration to ease concerns over the widespread destruction, degradation, and fragmentation of ecosystems globally. Many countries have already made a commitment to protect 30% of the planet's land and sea area by 2030. They will meet for a follow-on conference in April and May next year and try to agree on a set of goals to help make this happen. An agreement won't be easy as different countries are in different developmental stages, but there's understanding now that decisive actions need to be taken to ensure the well-being of humans as well as other lives on this planet. Taoyuan, CGTN, Kunming.
Isabel Hilton is founder and senior advisor of China Dialogue. I asked her how important it is for countries to look beyond their borders when trying to protect Earth's biodiversity.
There are countries that have grown rich, essentially, the better off countries, and they've done it by both emitting carbon and exploiting their own natural capital. We're at a point now where the world doesn't have enough natural capital for that model, which is a very old-fashioned model of development, to continue. But in order to support countries that have yet to develop, to do it another way, which is what we all need, there is an obligation, there's a moral obligation, there's also a lot of self-interest, frankly, in supporting them to preserve their nature rather than destroy it, as most developed countries did, or at least damage it. So this is a very welcome development, and I'm sure that, you know, other countries, already many countries are supporting this kind of thing, but it's very important to have a kind of coordinated effort to persuade emerging economies that you can grow prosperous without destroying nature.
President Xi also announced that China will build more wind and solar power bases in the country's desert areas. How will that help China's target to cap carbon emissions in 10 years' time?
Probably the best hedge against market fluctuations in price, against kind of shortages of fossil fuels, is to build more renewables. You know, that develops your own energy security and it helps with climate security. So, you know, this is clearly a good move. And to do it in areas that are not in competition for either food growing or grazing or other, you know, economic purposes that human beings would pursue. Desert areas are largely unexploited for any other purpose. So it's a very positive move, I think.
How do you think that Chinese perceptions of biodiversity have evolved over the years?
You know, China didn't have a lot of ecological headroom when it began its enormous industrial revolution, and there was already talk of crisis, you know, by the turn of the century. And that talk of crisis evolved into an understanding that there is a thing called natural capital, and if you waste it, then you are poorer. So that I think what was important in China is that it got beyond the you have to exploit nature to prosper, that kind of dichotomy. And Xi Jinping's speeches, the whole concept of eco-civilization is around a development model which takes a much more harmonious and sustainable view. Now, turning China's economy around is a long and a very large task, but at least there is an impetus to do so, and there's an understanding of the necessity to do so, and that's a big step forwards.
Just looking back at those wandering elephants that captured the imagination of China and the world earlier this year, how important is a moment like that when it comes to getting people behind conservation?
Some of the lessons that were taken from those wandering elephants was to ask the question, why did they wander? What was disturbing them? You know, are human beings encroaching on the last bits of habitat? And actually seeing these elephants, this family group wandering around, I think was very moving for people. I hope also that the longer term lesson is that biodiversity isn't just about charismatic megafauna like elephants or leopards or creatures that we love and admire. Everybody loves pandas, you know, but biodiversity is often about very small and unconsidered things like beetles or even fungi that are essential to ecosystems. And these are things with no appeal to our sentiment, but they're absolutely critical to supporting the ecosystems that we depend on as much as the elephants.
In other news from around the world, Shia Muslim cleric Muqtada al-Sadr has promised an Iraqi government that's free of foreign interference after his party won the most seats in Sunday's election. The results have been rejected by several pro-Iranian parties and armed groups. EU observers describe the vote as well managed, but said the low 41% turnout should send a clear message to the political elite.
Coalition talks have resumed in Germany as the Social Democrats try to form a government with the Greens and centre-right Free Democrats. Officials from the three parties say they hope to confirm initial progress by the end of the week. Both the SPD and the runner-up Conservatives need the backing of smaller parties to form a ruling coalition.
The European Union has promised to support Ukraine through a potential gas shortage, amid concern that Russia could hold back supplies. Leaders from the bloc are discussing the situation at a summit in Kiev. Ukraine has accused Russia's Gazprom of using energy as a weapon after it signed a gas transit deal with Hungary last month, bypassing Ukraine.
The International Criminal Court is asking judges to confirm charges against a Central African Republic rebel leader after his arrest in January. Mohamed Said Abdelkaim faces accusations of crimes against humanity as head of the so-called Salika faction. A judge said there were grounds to believe he was responsible for incidents of torture and enforced disappearances in 2013 when the Salika faction seized power.
Hong Kong has issued a storm warning as tropical cyclone Kompasu approaches. Ferries and bus routes have stopped running and people have been advised to stay at home. The same storm has already killed at least 11 people in the Philippines, with over 1,500 evacuated from their homes. The International Court of Justice has ruled on a border dispute between Somalia and Kenya. The case relates to contested coastal waters which are believed to be rich in oil and gas. The ruling sets a new sea boundary, largely in favour of Somalia's claim. Stefan de Vries is at The Hague for us. So, Stefan, tell us more.
Well, this afternoon, the International Court of Justice ruled largely in favour of Somalia in a feud that already started in 2009 when the two countries, Kenya and Somalia, disputed about a border in the Indian Ocean. Somalia said that it was entitled to a part of 100,000 square kilometers, which is believed to be rich in gas and oil, and Kenya said, no, this is our part. So they negotiated, then the negotiations led to nothing, and then Somalia decided to go to the International Court of Justice here in The Hague, just behind me. That took almost 5 years, and today the ICJ concluded that Somalia was actually entitled to this part of the Indian Ocean, but not everything. the judges, they split actually the area into Somalia, but also more or less in favor of Kenya. So there was a compromise. So that was the decision today here in The Hague.
Stefan, Kenya has said that it doesn't believe the court has jurisdiction. What implications is that going to have? I mean, will this ruling stick?
Well, that's an interesting question, of course, and people here were also asking the same question, because indeed Kenya does not recognize the International Court of Justice since the beginning of this year. It's actually the court of the United Nations. All the countries that are member of the United Nations come here when they have a quarrel between them. Now, Kenya said they do not recognize the ruling, but the thing is that the International Court of Justice doesn't have the means also to enforce their ruling. So what is going to happen next is a big question. It's an enigma, actually. Probably the two countries will go back to the table and to start negotiations again about this area, this contested area in the Indian Ocean. But it is not clear what will be the real impact of today's ruling here in The Hague.
It took 5 years even to get here. Stefan de Vries at The Hague, thank you.
Austria's parliament is debating a corruption investigation into former Chancellor Sebastian Kurz. 2 separate no-confidence motions have also been tabled against the government. Johannes Pleschberger reports from Vienna.
An opinion poll researcher has reportedly been arrested amid allegations she played a role in the corruption. Sabine Beinschab is alleged to have deleted a hard drive on her computer shortly before her office was searched by police. The investigations concern allegedly falsified polls in which former Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz was portrayed in a particularly positive light, with these polls then appearing in a free newspaper in exchange for government funds. It comes as Kurz's governing party has lost significant support according to a new survey. Many Austrians wish for a quick and complete investigation following the latest arrest.
This is a sign that something is broken in this world, that people can do stuff and just delete messages or delete important news or get laptops and hardware removed very fast and quick.
A lot of people fear that Kurz will still be kind of not the real chancellor, but the man who says what to do in on the background.
Meanwhile, political opponents of the former chancellor have tabled 2 motions of no confidence in parliament against members of the government who, they claim, remain loyal to Kurz. According to the opposition, this so-called Kurz system continues to exist despite the 35-year-old's resignation. Opponents have been angered by comments of Alexander Schallenberg, who was sworn in as Chancellor on Monday, that he will continue to work closely with his predecessor.
Of course, as Chancellor of the People's Party, I will proceed in close consultation with our Federal Party Chairman, Sebastian Kurz.
Within his own ruling People's Party, support for Sebastian Kurz seems to be waning. Some who initially supported the former chancellor have since sought to distance themselves from him and demanded the government to shun his influence, a sentiment which seems to be increasingly shared by the public. Johannes Pleschberger, CGTN, Vienna.
You're watching CGTN Europe. Still to come, why private companies have taken up the challenge of protecting wild elephants in China.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Some other news now. Coalition talks have resumed in Germany as the Social Democrats try to form a government with the Greens and centre-right Free Democrats. Officials from the three parties say they hope to confirm initial progress by the end of the week. Both the SPD and the runner-up Conservatives need the backing of smaller parties to form a ruling coalition.
The European Union has promised to support Ukraine through a potential gas shortage, amid concern that Russia could hold back supplies. Leaders from the bloc are discussing the situation at a summit in Kiev. Ukraine has accused Russia's Gazprom of using energy as a weapon after it signed a gas transit deal with Hungary last month, bypassing Ukraine.
Poland's Prime Minister has accused the opposition of spreading lies about a possible EU exit, insisting his country has no desire to leave the bloc. Mateusz Morawiecki is in Budapest for a summit of 4 Central European nations known as the Visegrad Group. Tens of thousands of Poles joined rallies over the weekend in support of European Union membership after a court ruled that parts of EU law were incompatible with Poland's constitution. More now on one of our top stories, the COP15 Biodiversity Summit in China. And one key to preserving species is genetic diversity.
It happens naturally in the wild, but is far trickier for zoos, where gene pools are often limited and little understood. But one zoo in Belgium is trying to change that, as Tony Waterman found out.
Between the lions, the gorillas, and penguins at the Antwerp Zoo, there are thousands of animals hidden from sight. The average visitor will likely never get a glimpse of these specimens because they're in a deep freeze in an underground lab. This is the zoo's biobank, one of 4 spread across Europe, collecting animal DNA samples for research and breeding programs. Dr. Philip Helsen and his team have already collected 4,000 samples: feathers, gills, tissue. They are each given a unique and tiny barcode.
For instance, this is the giraffe, and then I can collect that sample from that rack and send that specific sample to the researcher that requested.
The initiative is spearheaded by the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria and is a massive effort to better understand and boost genetic diversity within captured animal populations. Dr. Helsen says breeding programs have traditionally assumed 2 main things: that the animals are from the same species and unrelated. Genetic sequencing, though, has found that hasn't always been the case, which has led to a decline in genetic diversity. Dr. Helsen says some breeding programs may only be capturing 10 or 20% of the total genetic diversity, which can put those animals at an evolutionary disadvantage.
The more diverse you are, the better you will cope with extremes within the environment. So you have the tools to react to a new trigger that you are facing. And thinking about how things evolve right now, climate change and things like that, these are things why you need genetic diversity as being a species.
By collecting samples from zoos across Europe and analyzing the DNA, the Biobank project hopes to better understand an animal's lineage, ensuring close relatives aren't mating. This could help minimize inherited genetic mutations while also promoting disease resistance, eventually deepening the gene pool. The ultimate goal is to preserve genetically healthy populations long before they can reach the brink of extinction.
You might be able to reconstruct what used to be out there, but it's not an easy thing to do. And I think there are better ways to conserve biodiversity.
Thousands of tiny test tubes to ensure generations to come. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Antwerp, Belgium.
Now, this summer, millions of people were captivated by the story of a runaway elephant herd which went walkabout across China's Yunnan province.
The story of the family group, which toured villages and cities causing a little chaos, has inspired some businesses to focus their corporate social responsibility programs on local wildlife. CGTN's Zheng Junfeng reports.
Xishuangbanna, famous for its tropical beauty, is also home to the precious Asian wild elephants.
We're super lucky to have just spotted a family of Asian wild elephants right here, right in front of us, just minutes ago. Think about it. There are only around 350 of these wild elephants in the whole country. Their population seems quite small, but actually it has already doubled since the 90s thanks to China's efforts in protecting their habitats like this.
Protecting these elephants is neither easy nor cheap. It used to be solely the responsibility of the government and social groups. Now companies have joined in.
In the next 10 years, we have clear goals in reducing our carbon footprint. Swire Coca-Cola plans to reduce carbon emissions in operations by 70% and by 30% in the supply chains by 2030.
Less carbon emissions mean fewer climate change challenges for rainforests, home to wild elephants and thousands of other animals and plants. The natural reserve called Wild Elephant Valley stretches hundreds of kilometers across Yunnan, and for a long time, villagers on the edge of the reserve often saw their farm produce damaged by wild elephants. Now Swire Coca-Cola has teamed up with NGOs to change that.
We teach farmers to raise honeybees because, on the one hand, bees help plants reproduce and improve the biodiversity of the rainforest. On the other hand, bees also prevent wild elephants from entering farmlands and villages.
I was taught how to raise honeybees and I earn 5,000 yuan extra a year. I no longer have to go into the mountains to find bamboo shoots for extra income and risk encountering wild elephants, as it's not safe.
Swire Coca-Cola offered funding for farmers to replace rubber trees with mango and nut trees. In Phase 1, 300 mu of land will be replaced.
Replacing rubber trees with other eco-friendly trees can reduce carbon emissions and prevent landslides. At the same time, mangoes and nuts are not the favorite foods of elephants. So planting them around the villages will reduce human-elephant encounters.
On the way back, we met with another group of wild elephants in the reserve. They were one of the families that traveled to the north and returned. Their month-long trip attracted huge public attention. Many in China are now realizing that back to nature and not from nature is the need of the hour. We have to give back and coexist with all types of living things for a greener future. Zheng Junfeng, CGTN, Xishuangbanna, Yunnan Province.
And our headlines again. A downbeat assessment and a warning on stagflation. The message from the IMF's latest global health check.
The EU pledges more aid to Afghanistan as G20 leaders meet to discuss the worsening humanitarian situation.
And backing biodiversity. China's president launches a fund to safeguard species in developing countries.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching. More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, 24 hours a day on Preview. Coming up next on CGTN Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow at the same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye. Goodbye.